Welcome to this special 4th of July edition of Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. I'm Terrance Carroll, an ordained Baptist minister, public theologian, attorney, and former Speaker of the Colorado House of Representatives. Each episode of Faithful Witness explores the moral questions shaping our democracy, culture, and society from the perspective of the prophetic witness of the Black church. This week, I'm just going to speak for a little bit, or as the old folks in church say, I'm just going to tarry for a little bit about what does the 4th of July mean on the 250th anniversary of the American democratic experiment. Have we gone backwards, or have we been able to find a way forward to truly becoming a multicultural, a multi-ethnic, a pluralistic democracy? Or have we turned away from the promise of what America should be? Langston Hughes has a great quote. He says, "I swear to the Lord, I still can't see why democracy means everybody but me." On this day, those words have great meaning to me. Why democracy on this day seems to be more fragile than ever. Why does it seem like in this nation there's been a retrenchment from the commitments of democracy? Throughout history, there have been many folks in the Black community and in marginalized communities who have questioned whether the founders of this great nation really intended for this nation to be more than a nation for white men. More precisely, a nation for wealthy white men from a particular class, from a particular privileged place in society. And over the course of the last 250 years, as we've negotiated what it means to be an American, as we've negotiated what it means for this place to be a democracy, over time, as James Weldon Johnson wrote in Lift Every Voice and Sing, we've been through many troubles, toils, through which we've had to overcome. But we've overcome them, sometimes kicking, sometimes screaming, sometimes realizing what the right thing to do is, to get to a point where we're within grasping distance of saying that maybe we truly have become a multicultural and pluralistic society where all voices are heard, where all voices are valued. But unfortunately, on this day, I have to go back to the words of Langston Hughes. Why does democracy mean something for everybody but me? And I really hate to be this pessimistic on this great day where the Declaration of Independence was signed, but it appears that the words on the paper are being disregarded by so many so that they can obtain a little bit of power. That these words are being disregarded by so many so that they can oppress those folks that they're fearful of. It's a shame that the words of the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're all created equal, that some people are questioning if that truly is the truth, if we should continue to be an America that's an America for all people. As it says on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, give me your weak, give me your worn. It appears that we're retreating from that great promise, that great commitment, that great ideal, that the covenant of this country, the great covenant of what it means to be the United States of America, that we're all created equal, that we all have certain unalienable rights, that some folks want to run away from that, and we shouldn't. We should hold fast to those commitments that were written on paper, although when they were first written, they did not mean people like me. They did not mean people like my mother. They did not mean people like my grandfather. They did not mean folks like my great-grandfather, Charles Carroll, who was born an enslaved Black man in Southern Maryland. It didn't mean him. So it begs the question again, why does democracy mean everybody but me? And if you look at the actions of this administration, if you look at their policy priorities. It goes beyond your typical policy concerns. It goes beyond finding the common good in terms of how we address hunger and child poverty in this country. I read somewhere recently that this administration's policy, if you could call it that, is really about being actively against anyone who is not a white man. And I've talked about this, I think, earlier this week on this podcast on one of my shorts, that this administration has a preference for a particular type of white man, a white man who uses broadly a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man, but it goes beyond that to a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man who believes in Christian nationalism, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man who believes that the only folks whose opinion and whose history in this country matters is that of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man. It only matters if you're a cisgender straight white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man in this country. And if you're not that, and if you don't worship the right type of Jesus, if you don't worship the Aryan Jesus who has blonde hair and blue-eyed, if you don't worship the Aryan Jesus who believes that salvation is only available to a certain group of people, and if you don't believe that the Aryan blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus intended for a particular social order where waspy men were at the head of the social order, and the rest of us are only on this world to ensure that their power is perpetuated for time immemorial, somehow you're not part of the American dream. Somehow you were not intended to be a part of the great American democratic experiment. Again, I ask, why does democracy exist for everybody but me? I say again, it's a legitimate question. When you look at the failed attempt to limit mail-in ballots, if you look at the retrenchment from the Voting Rights Act by this United States Supreme Court, if you look at racial gerrymandering in this country, they're all attempts to erase and keep the marginalized, especially Black voters, from exercising fully their right to vote because they're afraid that if we vote, that their power would be minimized. They're afraid if we vote that we will continue to push for an American democracy that's multicultural and pluralistic. That's the reason that they don't want us to vote, because for America to be America, truly America, all of us have to be seen. All of us have to be heard. All of our voices have to be included in the great democratic tapestry. All of our faiths have to be seen as valid within the American democratic marketplace. And I will tell you that as a Christian minister, an ordained Baptist minister who loves Jesus Christ with all my heart, my faith is not diminished by the existence of other faiths in this country. My faith is not diminished by Muslims. I don't see the need to pass laws to banish Sharia law. I don't see a reason to pass zoning laws like they've done in Texas that are specifically targeted to keep mosques from being built. Islam does not frighten me. The good news of Jesus Christ is not diminished by the existence of Muslims in this country. And I'm not going to get into the question today of whether this nation was founded as a Christian nation, because most of you know how I feel about this. To say that we were created as a Christian nation, let me be more precise. To say that we were founded as a Christian nation is a historical lie from the pits of hell, perpetuated by folks who intend for this nation to be a white Christian enclave, exclusive of anyone else, including other Christian voices that compete with theirs, do not align with theirs. And sadly, this point where we are in American history is not anything new. Generation after generation, there are folks in this nation who have attempted to gain the reins of power to create this fantasy and perpetuate this fantasy and to live out this fantasy that this is a white Christian nation of a particular type. Some people like to compare what's going on in this country right now to what happened in Nazi Germany. I reject that notion, not because there aren't similarities, because it ignores the truth of what's happened in this nation far before the Nazis came to power in Germany. Let's just move to Andrew Jackson, who was president in the 1820s, 1830s, who was behind the Trail of Tears. If you read history and you look at the policies of Andrew Jackson, it was a white nationalist Christian experiment. He was a grifter. He was a racist. So what we have going on right now is more closely analogous to what happened under the administration of Andrew Jackson. What's happening now is aligned to what happened after the Civil War, once the Reconstruction era ended in 1876. At the end of the Reconstruction era, which was brought about by the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, because there was a dispute in the Electoral College, and Samuel Tilden narrowly won the popular vote, but Rutherford B. Hayes narrowly won the Electoral College. There was a dispute, and there was a real possibility that the vote would not have been certified in the United States Congress. So they struck a deal. The deal that was struck ended the Reconstruction period, which is that period between the end of the Civil War in 1876, where the United States government was engaged in a very strong effort to at least at some baseline level create equal rights for Black folks. This was the period when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were adopted. This was the period where Black folks had their first real taste of political and social power in this country with the election of Black men, to be precise, to political offices, high political offices throughout the South, serving as the majority in state legislatures, being elected to the United States Senate, being elected to the United States Congress. But that all ended with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, where the United States troops that were enforcing equality and ensuring that white folks who failed to comprehend that they lost the Civil War were still trying to intimidate Black folks. This was the period also where we had our first civil rights laws adopted to enshrine the notion that all of us in this country had equal voting rights, and all of us in this country should have civil rights. But that all ended in 1876. And shortly after that, we had what could be described as coups all throughout the South that purged Black folks from political office, that purged Black folks from positions of power and prestige throughout the South. Following the Reconstruction era, we found ourselves in the Jim Crow era, which lasted, if I had to put a pin in it, I would say it lasted until the adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what did we have happen during the Jim Crow era? We had restrictive voting laws that kept Black folks from exercising the franchise and being able to act as full citizens. Voting is the marker that you're a full citizen, that you're able to influence the government through your vote. Why do you think these folks out here now are trying to limit voting rights and the ability for Black folks and other marginalized groups to elect their candidate of choice? Because they understand, sometimes better than our own people, that voting is the marker of full citizenship. So during the Jim Crow era, we had these written tests and verbal tests that even the folks giving the tests could not pass. During the Jim Crow era, we had the development of segregated water fountains. We had the rise of this thing called the lost cause mythology, which promoted the idea that slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War, but that the folks in the South really just wanted to protect their heritage from the evildoers up north. But when you look at the Constitution, if you look at the writings of succession, the Declaration of Succession, it was all about slavery. It was all about Christian nationalism. And don't get me wrong, there's no mistaking that the Southern slavocracy could also be considered a Christian nationalist slavocracy because they pointed to the Bible as justification for what they were doing, much like many of these folks are doing today. So again, I ask, why does democracy apply to everyone but me? Why are these folks so afraid of having a real democracy? Why are these folks so afraid of people who aren't white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant men having a say in democracy? Why? And you should ask that question over and over again, especially as we celebrate the 4th of July, the 250th anniversary of this nation. I want to close with the story of Mum Betts, later known as Elizabeth Freeman. She was enslaved to a family in Boston, Massachusetts during this Revolutionary War era, 1776, 1775 or so. And her family that she was enslaved to were patriots. And I say that with air quotes, but this family was very involved in the movement to found this new nation. And folks often thought back then that their enslaved folks were ignorant and that they didn't hear things, they didn't understand things, but that was far from true. My enslaved ancestors heard every word that came out their mouths. And so it was with Mum Betts. She heard them talking about this thing called the Declaration of Independence, this thing that said that we're all created equal and that we all have certain unalienable rights. She even heard that the state of Massachusetts believed this to be so true, were so convicted by these words, that the state of Massachusetts put those words in its constitution. Having listened to how her enslavers described those words, that it meant that we were all equal, it meant that we all had the same rights. Having listened to her enslavers talk about these words in such glorious terms, she understood that these words apply to her. So in 1780, she filed suit in the Massachusetts Supreme Court, alleging that the words in the Massachusetts Constitution, which were the same words in the Declaration of Independence, were incompatible with slavery. This illiterate, uneducated woman, uneducated in a formal sense, understood that those words had meaning, that those words had substance, that those words bound us all together in a sacred covenant. And she sued. You know what? The Massachusetts Supreme Court agreed with her and freed her. And this, by implication, ended slavery in Massachusetts in 1781. My mother, Corinne Dimple Carroll, embedded in me that same belief that those words mean something. They have substance, and that we should continue to fight every day to make those words be true.